It's a bit grand to say that I'm working on a book. If anybody asks to see the manuscript, I don't know much to show them, but it's a kind of aspiration, and it's something I've been sort of interested in for, I guess, at least 20 years or so. I guess the real topic is, again, the war on drugs. And we've heard some really interesting ideas, thoughts, and information from Neil and from Peter before. In a way, there's a sort of irony, because here we are in this absolutely beautiful place, this lovely city, beautiful day. The police aren't breaking down the doors. I'm speaking publicly. This is being recorded, so on and so forth. It doesn't feel here, sitting here now, that there is this utterly brutal and catastrophic war going on. And when I say war, I don't mean that entirely as a metaphor, but it is going on. And we heard from Neil about the institutional consequences. We know from our own personal knowledge, things we read, and so forth. Yeah, there is damage being done in so many horrible ways. I don't need to list them. Everybody can think of their own. That raises a question, which is why? I mean, it's a bit strange if you think about it. You know, if somebody came along and said, look, I think we should wage a war on pleasure, you'd think they were mad. You'd think this is a really, really strange idea. And if somebody said, I think we should wage a war on people being able to change, alter, explore the most fundamental aspect of them, their own consciousness, described as self-intoxication. If you have a certain view of these things, I think freedom of consciousness is an alternative formulation. If somebody said, let's wage that war, you'd think at first, that's very strange. And yet, that's the background. That is where we are. These seemingly mad things are taking place. So I think, why? And of course, drugs use can become drug abuse. That's a bad thing. And one can entirely understand well-meaning, if misguided, efforts to try and do something about that. But wars are pathological. I mean, it's a lot more than just, well, we want to make sure that vulnerable people aren't harmed. There's clearly a lot more going on than that. And historians point to many causes. Institutional, you've got racism, you've got power grabbing by institutions, you've got panics, you've got historical accidents, you've got all an even benign and well-motivated ideas about protecting people from their own weaknesses and so forth. And all of these things, they've obviously played a role. But I suppose the question which I'm posing, I say I'm posing, it's not an original question from me, but it is something that maybe hasn't had as much attention as it might merit, is there something more? Is part of the continuing drive behind the war on drugs something a bit deeper and more fundamental? Is it motivated in part by a belief which might not be articulated much these days, that drug use and all the things that go with that are inherently immoral and wrong? And it's not something that has had a huge amount of attention as an argument. but if it's there, that might be very important. That's where Peter Hitchens comes in. That's the book, 2012. Peter Hitchens, as many of you might know, he's a journalist. He's a conservative with a small c. He's not a fan of the Conservative Party, but he's a conservative with a small c. And my own personal view of Hitchens is that some of the things that he writes and says, I agree with. He's a good civil libertarian, at least in part, anyway. But when it comes to drugs, he is a warrior. But he's a very special kind of warrior. So he wrote or rather, there was published by him in 2012, this book with the title, The War We Never Fought, The British Establishment's Surrender to Drugs. It's a sort of three-layered book. And in a sense, the first two layers, interesting though they are not really what I want to talk about, but I'll just briefly say what they are. The top layer is history. He's looking at the reform of British drug laws in the 60s, 70s. I say drug laws and enforcement, and so forth. And from the 60s through to the 90s, early 2000s. And his main point is that there was an organized movement to bring about the practical decriminalization of drug use. And he documents that, and I'm not a historian, there seems to be at least some truth in what he says. It's very interesting, it's interesting history, and so forth. That's the first layer. The second layer is, it's anecdotal material, I'm sure some of which is true, to show that in some cases drugs cause harm. Well, okay. Not sure that it takes the debate much further. It's not particularly relevant to what I want to talk about. It's the third layer. It's the deepest layer. That's the thing that I find interesting. Because scattered in this book, and it's not set out with all respect to Hitchens in perhaps the clearest way, but I suppose if you want a summary, a sort of short summary, he says this on page 30. He says, do we think the use of these drugs is wrong? Do we think that the law can be effective in limiting their use? Note the word wrong. My answer to both these questions is yes. The crucial and moral and cultural divide, which is at the heart of the debate about drugs, lies here. I believe, and this is the bit that I've underlined, self-stupefaction is absolutely morally wrong for reasons which I set out below. Now, part of the problem with the book is I don't think he really does set out the reasons below. I mean, I've sort of been through it and I've got lots of underlinings, but I couldn't find a place where he lists the reasons why he claims that self-stupefaction is absolutely morally wrong. And it might be interesting to see a follow-up book on that question by him. And in a sense, that's the sort of thing which I've been thinking about. But the importance of that argument is there's nothing to do, or it doesn't depend upon showing balance of harms and so forth. It's a categorical statement. It shouldn't be done because it's wrong. Simple as that. Now, of course, you can dig down philosophically, and it's a very interesting question as to what that means, and how does he get to that, and what are the implications, and so forth. But his fundamental point is, well, it's wrong, and it shouldn't be allowed for that reason. That's why it shouldn't be allowed, because it's fundamentally morally wrong to do it. Now, that's, in a way, of course, it's not a new idea. We'd seen in the West, Europe, North America, and other places, abolitionist movements. There are world religions that proscribe any use of intoxicants. But you might think, well, it's kind of a bit old-fashioned. It's not really what the debate is all about now. Things have moved on. It's more a utilitarian type debate. Well, there are certain medicinal benefits or psychological and so forth that might flow, and it's bad, and there are adverse consequences to this, but the adverse consequences, weigh it all up and see where we get, sort of thing. And of course, that is much of the contemporary debate on the legalization or not of drugs. And there are very few politicians, I think, certainly in this country and perhaps in the West generally, who would publicly say, I don't care what the evidence is, I'm not interested. It's just wrong, and we are going to continue to fight drug use because it shouldn't be allowed because it's wrong. There are not many politicians who put it in those terms, but Hitchins' book, that part of it at least, did get me wondering. And it's not so much the question of is he right or wrong. I have my views. I'm sure most of the people in this room have a view on that question. But there's a secondary question, which is, well, how relevant is that question? How relevant or is the holding of those views, whether expressly or at some deeper level by people, how relevant is it to the fact that we still have a global war on drugs? I suppose to put it another way, how much of the war on drugs is motivated by misguided ideas about harm reduction on the one hand, bad for people, therefore it should be stopped, as opposed to things based on the idea that, based on disgust and revulsion and fear, and the idea that really this is just an abominable business and people shouldn't be taking drugs. It's just a bad thing. It's a moral abomination. And it's hard for us, I say us. The people here are here for a reason. We have a sort of opposite view, certainly as regards psychedelics, that this is a culture, it's a thing to be celebrated, not a thing that's disgusting. But say it's a gift, not some kind of evil. But what bothers me is that there are certain features of the war on drugs that I think suggest that, or perhaps are only explicable or point to this element of moral disgust being a serious part of what's going on, a serious motivator of the war on drugs. And there are two things in particular that strike me, that I see as features of something being regarded as just wrong, morally wrong. And the first of those is a near, and I say near, total disregard of the positive. Now you might say, in the context of the psychedelic renaissance, well, that's a strange thing to say. You can't, not a day goes by without there being an article in The Guardian on the virtues of medicinal psilocybin and so forth. But I think if you sort of expand out if we expand out our view, look at debates about the recent debate about nitrous oxide, or the endless ongoing debate about cannabis legalization, which makes some progress, and it's not glacially slow, but it's still slow. What you don't tend to find is people saying, well, these things should be legalized, or these things shouldn't be illegal, because they give a lot of people a lot of pleasure. A lot of people really, really enjoy and get a lot out of, in many ways, from the use of these drugs. And that's not to say abuse, blah, 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 blah. But you just don't hear this. You don't hear it in the official policy debates. If you looked at the terms of I think it was the committee that was reporting on nitrous oxide, you didn't see much about, people do it presumably because it feels good. And what's wrong with that? And isn't that something of value? And so in a sense, and of course, if something is morally wrong and bad, then the fact that it might give some pleasure is neither here nor there. You don't say, well, it's all right to kill somebody because when you killed somebody, it felt good. Of course, nobody would say that. That's completely mad. But yes, in a sense, that's the way that the drugs debate even now proceeds. That, as I say, with some exceptions, and there is some progress, and that's a great thing, but still, at a greater level, the positive is almost regarded as irrelevant, just unseemly, not something. At best, one can say it doesn't do any harm, or it doesn't do much harm. But to actually go further and say, actually, cannabis is listen to music, sex, whatever, fantastic. That sort of thing it doesn't feature in the debate, and it does seem to me that that's a hallmark of regarding something as just morally wrong. It's not relevant that it might make some things nice for you. Who cares? It's just a bad thing. So that's the first aspect of the war on drugs, that does make me think that the sort of view that Hitchins articulates, or semi-articulates, I think there's more work for him to do on that, is maybe more relevant than we might think when we have the more utilitarian style policy debates. And the second feature that, to me, has the hallmarks, or some of the hallmarks of a moral case, is just the sheer ferocity of the war on drugs. And, of course, what Hitchins says, and he's right about this, is that there didn't used to be a distinction, or there was, but it didn't have the importance that it assumed after the 1971 misuse of drug acts, between possession on the one hand, well, I put use, possession, it's called possession, it's basically use on the one hand, and all the market activities, manufacturing, growing, distribution, etc., selling, on the other hand. And Hitchins' point is that division, or one of the points that he makes in the historical part of his book, is that by carving off use and possession as something different from the very bad thing of manufacturing and so forth, it made it easier to semi-decriminalize or practically decriminalize the use aspect. They're just people, blah, 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 blah. But the corollary of that, the consequence of that, is that the other aspect, market aspect, was demonized. Now, Neil has already spoken very, very interestingly, and I learned a lot from his talk about the institutional pathologies that demon. Is that me? I'm good. That the terrible institutional pathologies, both within the state and outside the state, that are created by that demonization, by that absolute focus on the market aspect, those participants as being the new devils. And the language that is used, purveyors of death and so forth. And if it were just sort of nasty people with big tattoos on their necks who are going around with guns killing people in Colombia, well, okay. But it's not just people like that. I think almost everybody here will have heard of Ross Ulbricht, the then 26-year-old American who set up the Silk Road drugs market, online drugs market. Now, you can have different views, but there's certainly an argument that he was creating for the first time a relatively safe, non-violent drugs marketplace as an alternative to the sort of institutional horrors that Neil talked about before. He was caught, and he was prosecuted, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And he's been in prison, I think, for 11 years, that's right. And as far as we know, he will never be released. And it seems to me it's quite hard to explain that in terms of a sort of, well, we're very concerned about some of the harms that some drugs might do, and we want to deal with it, and so forth. Well, I get that, but, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. To me, at least, that sort of thing has a moral overtone. He's being treated as bad, as though he were a gun-toting Colombian drug lord, and that just makes me question: is there something going on here that we're not perhaps grappling with? So, the summary is that, or the takeaway is, if there is something in what I say, and if the Hitchins view, whatever its philosophical strengths or weaknesses, is a view that is held more widely, just the idea that it's just a wrong thing, then we have to grapple with that maybe a little more than we do. Because otherwise, we're always entering into a debate with a big sort of unspoken shadow that we've not really grappled with. And if it's really there, if we don't grapple with it, then what's going to make it go away? So, or to put it another way, it's if we don't grapple with it, then it's going to make winning a lot harder. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. Got some more points, but I'll try and sneak them into answers to questions.
Thank you, David.